This used to be home to 3,000 people. There was a hospital with its own X-ray machine, a golf course with 9 holes carved out of the jungle, a main street lined with clapboard houses that could have been plucked straight from Michigan. Today, vines crawl through the windows. The swimming pool is a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and the American flags that once flew over Manager's Row have long since rotted away in the Amazon rain. This is Fordlandia, Henry Ford's forgotten city, a place where the assembly line met the rainforest, and neither survived. There is a growing community of people who believe these stories deserve to be told. If you are one of them, subscribe and join us. Standing here today, you can still see the bones of what Henry Ford built. The concrete foundations of the sawmill, the rusted machinery scattered like dinosaur skeletons through the undergrowth. The dock that was built too low for the seasonal floods, now permanently underwater for half the year. You can still see it, if you know where to look. The town that exists now has about 3,000 residents. Modest homes built inside the shells of Ford's original structures. A small school, a church. Life, but not the life Ford imagined. Not the life he spent $20 million trying to create. The water tower still stands, 94 years later, with Ford's name barely visible through the rust and jungle growth. It is the tallest structure for hundreds of miles, a monument to American ambition in the middle of the Amazon. But walk the streets where Ford's managers once lived, and you will find something else entirely. Nature has reclaimed most of what man tried to impose. The golf course is a tangle of cecropia trees. The tennis courts are buried under decades of fallen leaves. The fire hydrants, painted regulation red like the ones in Dearborn, Michigan, now serve as perches for toucans and parrots. This is what remains of Henry Ford's jungle city. This is Fordlandia's ghost. It began with rubber. In 1928, Henry Ford had a problem. His Model T required 30 pounds of rubber per car. His new Model A needed even more. And 90% of the world's rubber came from British and Dutch plantations in Southeast Asia. Ford hated being dependent on anyone for anything. So he looked at a map of Brazil and saw 2.5 million acres of Amazon rainforest for sale. The price was $125,000, roughly the size of Connecticut, for less than what Ford spent on advertising in a month. The Brazilian government was eager to sell. They needed the investment. They needed the jobs. And Henry Ford, in 1928, was the most famous industrialist in the world. If anyone could make the jungle bloom with rubber trees, surely it was the man who had revolutionized manufacturing. Ford's vision was grand and simple. He would build an American town in the heart of the Amazon, complete with every modern convenience. His workers would live like Americans, eat like Americans, and work like Americans. In return, they would produce rubber like Americans. Efficiently, productively, profitably. He named it Fordlandia, and he never set foot in the place. The first construction crew arrived in July 1928, led by Ford manager Einar Oxholm. They brought prefabricated buildings designed for Michigan winters. They brought American architectural plans calling for screened porches and steep-pitched roofs. They brought fire hydrants and street lamps and everything needed to build a proper American town. What they did not bring was any understanding of the Amazon. The prefabricated buildings rotted in the humidity within months. The dock was built at the wrong height and flooded every rainy season. The steep roofs trapped heat instead of shedding it. But Ford was undeterred. This was America's first major corporate expansion into the Amazon. It would work because it had to work. By 1934, Fordlandia had become something remarkable. A complete American town in the middle of nowhere. The population peaked at 3,000 residents. There was a hospital with the most modern equipment in the Amazon. A 9-hole golf course where Ford executives played every evening after work. A swimming pool, a tennis court, a movie theater that showed the latest Hollywood films. Main Street looked like it belonged in Michigan. Clapboard houses painted white with green trim, screened porches where families gathered in the evenings, gardens where wives grew tomatoes and corn, shipped as seeds from the United States. The town had its own currency, Fordlandia script that could be spent at the company store, its own post office with an official Brazilian postal designation, its own brass band that played American songs every Sunday in the town square. Managers' Row housed the American executives and their families. These were substantial homes with electric fans, modern plumbing, and manicured lawns maintained by local groundskeepers. The contrast was stark. While American managers lived in air-conditioned comfort, Brazilian workers lived in company barracks, dormitory-style buildings with minimal furnishing. The social hierarchy was as carefully planned as the town's geometry. Americans at the top, skilled Brazilian workers in the middle, laborers at the bottom. But it was a functioning community. Children attended the company school, where classes were taught in both English and Portuguese. Families shopped at the company store, which stocked everything from canned peaches to Ford Motor Company work shirts. The hospital delivered babies and treated everything from malaria to broken bones. There was a barber shop, a bakery, and a cafeteria that served meals to hundreds of workers daily. At its peak, Fordlandia felt like success. A modern town carved from primeval jungle. American efficiency imposed on tropical chaos. It was everything Henry Ford believed American industry could accomplish anywhere in the world. But beneath the surface, something was already changing. Have you ever driven through Fordlandia, Brazil? The rubber trees tell the story of everything that went wrong. Ford planted them in neat geometric rows, like corn in Iowa. Thousands upon thousands of identical trees, spaced exactly 12 feet apart, stretching toward the horizon in perfect formation. It was industrial agriculture applied to the Amazon. And it was a catastrophic mistake. In the wild, rubber trees grow scattered throughout the rainforest, separated by dozens of other species. This natural spacing protects them from leaf blight, a fungus that can devastate rubber crops. But when you plant rubber trees in concentration, the blight spreads like wildfire from tree to tree to tree. Ford's orderly plantation became a highway for disease. By 1935, entire sections of the plantation were dying. Leaves turned brown and fell off. Bark cracked and oozed. Trees that had taken years to mature were dead within months. Ford's agricultural experts tried everything: new fungicides, different planting patterns, resistant varieties imported from other countries. Nothing worked. The Amazon had its own rules, and Henry Ford's industrial methods were not among them. But the agricultural failure was just the beginning. Ford had imposed something else on Fordlandia that was even more toxic than his farming methods. He had imposed his vision of American moral improvement. Brazilian workers were required to eat hamburgers and canned food in the company cafeteria. No rice, no beans, no fish, no local cuisine whatsoever. They were required to attend mandatory square dancing lessons every Tuesday evening, poetry readings on Thursday nights, and they were absolutely forbidden from drinking alcohol, gambling, or playing soccer. In other words, they were forbidden from being Brazilian. The cultural imperialism created a simmering resentment that grew worse with each passing month. Workers talked quietly among themselves about the arrogance of these Americans who thought they could change not just the jungle, but the people who lived in it. And that brings us to December 20th, 1930. It started with rumors. Pay cuts were coming, forced medical examinations, more restrictions on the workers' already limited freedoms. Whether the rumors were true did not matter. What mattered was that after 6 years of cultural oppression, the Brazilian workers had reached their limit. December 20th, 1930. A hot, humid morning like any other. But by noon, Fordlandia was in chaos. The event became known as the breaking. It began in the cafeteria when workers refused to eat the mandated American meal. Then it spread to the sawmill, then the construction sites, then throughout the entire town. Workers smashed equipment with sledgehammers. They overturned Ford Motor Company vehicles and rolled them into the river. They chased American managers through the streets with machetes, forcing them to flee into the jungle for their lives. For 3 days, Brazilian workers controlled Fordlandia completely. They occupied the hospital, the administrative offices, and manager's row. They destroyed records, scattered files, and dismantled the symbols of Ford's authority piece by piece. Several Americans were injured. None were killed, but only because they ran fast enough and far enough to escape. The revolt made international headlines. Time magazine called it an embarrassing colonial failure. The New York Times described it as American industrial arrogance meeting its match in the Amazon. Brazilian military police eventually restored order, but the damage was irreversible. Not just to buildings and equipment, but to Ford's vision of what Fordlandia could become. After the breaking, the population began to decline. Slowly at first. A few families here, a few workers there. But steadily, month after month, year after year. By 1940, fewer than 500 people remained in a town built for 10,000. The American managers who stayed grew increasingly isolated and bitter. The Brazilian workers who remained did so only because they had nowhere else to go. And Henry Ford, sitting in his office in Dearborn, Michigan, refused to acknowledge that anything had gone wrong. He never visited Fordlandia. He never modified his approach. He remained convinced that his methods would eventually succeed if applied with sufficient discipline and determination. This is the pattern I keep seeing. Whether it is a company, a city, or an invention. The same forces that create something remarkable are often the same forces that destroy it. In 1945, Henry Ford II sold Fordlandia to the Brazilian government for $244,200. After 17 years and an estimated $20 million in investment, Ford recovered roughly 3% of what the company had spent. It remains one of corporate America's most expensive failures in Latin America. Today, Fordlandia lives quietly along the Tapajós River. The 3,000 residents who call it home have built their community inside the skeleton of Ford's dream. Some of the original buildings still stand, converted into homes and small businesses. The water tower remains the tallest structure for hundreds of miles, a rusted monument to American ambition that now serves as a cell phone tower for the local community. The Brazilian government designated Fordlandia as a historical site in 2017. Archaeologists study it as evidence of 20th century colonialism. Business schools use it as a case study in corporate overreach. Tourists occasionally arrive by riverboat to see the ruins of what one writer called Ford's folly. But for the people who live here now, Fordlandia is not a symbol or a cautionary tale. It is simply home. They fish in the river that Ford's dock was built too low to accommodate. They grow cassava and plantains in soil that refused to support Ford's rubber trees. They live as their grandparents lived, adapted to the rhythms of the Amazon in ways that Henry Ford never understood and never tried to learn. Standing here, you can almost hear what this place used to sound like. The whistle that called workers to their shifts, the brass band playing on Sunday afternoons, the voices of children speaking English and Portuguese in the company school. But those sounds are gone now, absorbed by the jungle that has reclaimed most of what man tried to impose. Places remember, even when people forget, and that is the part that stays with you. Fordlandia teaches us something about the limits of industrial power and the persistence of local wisdom, about what happens when we try to remake the world in our own image without first understanding the world as it actually is. Remember, this video is for educational purposes only. Always do your own research. Subscribe to Arthur Lee's Adventures for more stories of corporate empires and forgotten cities. And let me know in the comments, have you ever visited a place where nature has reclaimed human ambition?